The next thing we will see quite a lot of here in our strand line on the coast are these different egg cases. And I'm sure somebody is going to tell me what we might call these if we found one. Somebody like to come off mute and tell me what we might call these, or pop it in the chat. As a child, you probably were told that these were called something, perhaps an item of clothing for a mermaid. I'm sure we all know that these were called mermaids' purses when we were growing up. And they are actually ray or skate egg cases, typically black or brown, kind of horned at these ends, and the egg would be in here. So we'd see different types of those as well, so different sizes, different colorations. This has got a brown tinge to this one, it's probably a skate rather than a ray. The larger ones perhaps being more ray than skates. But you can actually download a nice guide to these, and you can go off and sort of find them and identify them. But yes, so mermaids' purses are actually egg cases for these creatures. We also might see other egg cases as well. So these, again, I remember being called sponges when I was younger, and they are actually whelk eggs. So this is the whelk egg, the whelk shell, and actually these sponges here are the cases for their eggs, and each of these little tiny capsules that you can see here would contain thousands of their eggs. And actually they're not great whelks, actually. So when the first eggs do start to hatch out, they will then use the other eggs as food. They will actually sort of survive off of the other eggs in that cluster. And so not all of those are going to kind of make it into an adult shell or adult creature. They're going to be used to actually feed the rest, or the others that hatch more quickly. So that's our whelks or whelk egg cases, and kind of moves us on then nicely to shells, really. So we're going to look at a couple of different shells, and let's look at the common whelk first. These are the larger whelk shells that you might find, sort of 10 centimeters. So you might pick them up and go, you know, can you hear the sea in them if you were younger? And you might also find a hermit crab in there, so you'd be careful if you are trying to listen to the sea in them. So that's a common whelk. And let's go on and have another look then at our dog whelks. These are the smaller shells, about 4 centimeters, and they are actually a predator. So they predate on themselves. We'll see earlier on when they are, they eat themselves when they're in their egg cases, but also they're not very nice in another regard as well. So you might see holes in shells, and I know that again it was another pastime that we had when we were younger. Can we find the shells with holes in them? And it's quite likely, in fact, that a dog whelk has come along and drilled itself through that shell, sucked out the creature from it within. So they're not very nice dog whelks at all. So that's where that hole could have come from in any of the shells that you've collected on the beach. And limpets, lastly, again, a creature that perhaps we take for granted, that rounded shell stuck onto the rocks and the hard surfaces down on the coast. But they're really quite an interesting creature. They've got a powerful tongue that kind of scrapes away at the hard surface that they would like to habitate. And they scrape that scar into the surface, and that's how they cling onto it. So if you've ever tried to remove a limpet, you'll know that's really quite difficult. And please don't try and do that. But at high tide, what they do actually do is leave their little scours to scavenge for their food and algae that they'd like to eat. But always, always, always when the tide comes, goes back out, sorry, they go back to exactly the same place. Wherever they scoured that original hole or that original scar to cling onto, they'll always go back. So you can't move limpets, but limpets can actually move. So that's, you know, quite an interesting fact, I think, about limpets. It's quite amazed the first time I heard about that. So that's our shells. Oh, so we've got slipper limpets at the back there. I forgot we'd pop that one in. Again, you very, very prominent on some of our beaches. Thinking of our sort of southeastern shoreline, especially sort of St Helens and Bembridge. Lots and lots and lots of these slipper limpets, and they're so called because if you look at this, it looks a little bit like a slipper. So you might pop your foot in there and have your slipper across the top there. So that's our slipper limpet. They're non-native actually, although they're very found, you know, quite prolifically across some of our beaches. They're not actually native. They came 100 years ago off the bottom of boats from the Africas, and we can see those in stacks. Actually, they kind of stack on top of each other, up to maybe 12 in height. And what they do is they change sex. So the bottom one would start off as a female, and then they'd get to 12 and change and go back round. So they form these kind of colonies, as we might call them, onto sort of larger stacks of them, up to about 12. I've not seen 12, I've seen about 5 or 6 stacked together. So yeah, quite interesting again, slipper limpets. And again, something that we see lots and lots of is cuttlefish. And I might be quite nasty in saying, is, you know, what might we see there? And we don't see the cuttlefish, obviously, we see the cuttlefish bone. And this bone here washes up after the fish has died, after it's bred, and they sort of last for about 2 years. And they will breed just before that time, and then they would die. We can see some of them up to 45 centimetres on the Strand line, and some of them quite small. But I think what's really cool again about the cuttlefish, and what might not be well known, is they can actually change their colour and camouflage themselves. There's some really good sort of pictures on the Wildlife Trust website, if you're interested, that shows you these creatures as they are in the sea. With they look a little bit like a squid, and they kind of pulse an energy and of light through their bodies, so they can actually mimic or camouflage themselves in the sea underneath in the water. So again, cuttlefish bone that you might just see there, they are actually quite a really interesting creature in their own right too. So lots of interesting creatures that we might see along the Strand line that looks quite, you know, everyday to us. If we're, as we do, we live on the coast, some of these things that we might see quite a lot of the time, but they do have an interesting backstory as well. And there's another couple of examples of these here. So we've got bryozoans, and this here, this hornwrack, again, I might be quite nasty and say, what are you looking at? Somebody might say a seaweed, but it's in fact not a seaweed. It's made up of tiny, tiny little organisms. So if I show you this one over here, which is in fact a sea mat, you can just start to see it stitched together there, almost like fabric, tiny cells there. And this is making this sea mat, which is actually colonized a piece of seaweed here. And what's really, really interesting, you've got barnacles on here as well. We've got some little keel worms up here, as well as this sea mat. And the sea mats can actually be really, really lovely patterns as well. Some of them just look like flowers, in fact. Thinking of the acidilia that you might see. I've seen that at Bembridge. It's really gorgeous. It looks like daisies, but it's actually this sea mat organism. So again, really, really interesting just to kind of look down and see what we're looking at. So thank you for coming along today. I hope you have learnt something new about the Strand line.